Dobro večer i dobrodošli na jednu obiteljsku večer sa Bojanom i Igorom. To je divna bila koincidencija da smo par prijatelja koji su nam jako dragi i važni nama i šire u Zagrebu, pa i šire od toga da smo uspjeli dobiti u momentu kad su oboje mogli doći tu do Zagreba i iskoristiti zapravo priliku prvi dio vezano uz Bojanu knjige koju smo mi iz Mame Bukse objavili zajedno sa ljubljanskom maskom i Igora koji je nešto malo ranije zadnji put bio u Zagrebu, ali i Igorove poznanstva i suradnje tu u Zagrebu i u Hrvatskoj. Tako da evo, sretni smo jer dugo smo dogovarali još od prošle godine, pa evo, ovaj put je uspjelo da ovo imamo family meeting, to je jedno obiteljsko druženje. Za večera smo planirali dramaturgiju dešavanja tako da ćemo prvo razgovarati 45 minuta do maksimalno sat vremena i razgovarati, nadam se onda i sa vašima intervencijama i pitanjima Bojana i ja vezano uz njezinu knjigu, a onda od 7:30 će Igor imati jednu svoju izvedbu. Tako da, evo, nadam se da će biti interesantno i što se i dramaturgije tiče. Što se tiče naše gošće, Bojane Kunst, Bojana koja je filozofkinja, teoretičarka izvedbenih umjetnosti, dramaturginja, Bojana je kao članica kolektiva, znači izdavačkog časopisnog kolektiva Maska iz Ljubljane, ako se ne varam, najstarijeg europskog, možda čak i svjetskog teatarskog časopisa koji je prošle godine slavio 100 godina i više od početka izlaženja, ali koji je onda u momentu kad je 90. godina bio zapravo baš revitaliziran sa jednom novom generacijom suradnika, Bojana je već od 90. godina kao jedna od glavnih suradnica i glavnih članova Maske važna bila prije svega naravno na slovenskoj sceni, no onda već od kraja druge polovice 90. godina, kako se i generacijski, evo, tako to bilo potrefilo, Bojana je zapravo postala jednako tako i zagrebačka, pa rekao bi kasnije i beogradska teoretičarka. To se prije svega radi o suradnji, Bojaninoj suradnji i prisutnosti u Zagrebu preko danas, nažalost, više ne postoji časopisa za izvedbene umjetnosti Frakcija i kasnije onda, što se Beograda tiče, i tu je bila ta onda već jugoslavenska jedna transverzala ili linija Beograd-Zagreb-Ljubljana obratnim smjerom, teorija kao hoda, isto također jedan časopisni izdavački projekt i kolektiv, da je Bojana zapravo, i kad pogledate njezinu bibliografiju tekstova na hrvatskomu, sve do knjige koju tu vidite ispred nas i koja je neposredni povod njezinog boravka danas u Zagrebu, Bojan, mislim, ako se ne varam, 14 ili 15 tekstova su joj izašli u Frakciji. Frakcija koja je inače digitalizirana i dostupna je arhiva na webu, tako da i svakako to i konzultirate. Tako da na neki način, evo rekao, mislim da je u tom smislu nije samo family meeting, to da imamo jedan par koji večeras tu s nama zajedno, već zapravo nakon 6 godina, posljednji put je Bojana gostovala u Zagrebu, ako se ne varam, na promociji knjige Sergeja Pristaša Exploded Case 2018. godine, da je ovo konačno mislim da se ponovo vidimo. Ova sama knjiga Život, umjetnosti, poprečne linije, brige, je, i to je, mislim, isto također jedna interesantna okolnost. Ovo je 6. ili 7. ako se ne varam, Bojanina knjiga. Ona je izašla skoro pa istovremeno na 3 jezika i u sklopu jednog suradničkog projekta nas iz Mame, Bukse i Maske i naših kolega iz Beča, iz također onoga dosta važnog kolektiva intelektualaca, intelektualki EIPCP. Knjiga je izašla skoro pa istovremeno na njemačkome, na slovenačkome i na hrvatskome. Tako da evo, to je bio jedan primjer, mislim kako, evo, kad se male ruke slože, može se i tako nešto realizirati. A mi smo naravno toliko sretni zato što je ovo, kao što sam napomenuo, zapravo prva Bojanina monografija na hrvatskome. U dosadašnjem radu mislim da bi svakako trebalo spomenuti i vjerojatno do sad najzapaženiju knjigu do ove, Bojanina knjiga o umjetnicima i umjetnicama na djelu, knjiga o blizini ili bliskosti kapitalizma umjetnosti, knjiga koja je, čini mi se, do sad na neki način u recepciji Bojaninoga djela do sad bila najistaknutija. Toliko od mene i sad toliko na ovome jednome jeziku. Jedno pitanje koje ćemo si možda ostaviti za kraj, ali onda to neće biti na engleskom, s kojom ćemo sad nastaviti govoriti, tako da nemamo asimetriju Bojane koja govori i hrvatski, ali ne toliko možda dobro i tečno da bi onda to bila simetrična situacija. Jedno pitanje koje ćemo možda ostaviti za kraj ili nekako, ako vas to interesira, možda razgovaramo o razlici kera, onda skrbi na slovenačkome, zorge na njemačkome i u hrvatskome brige ili skrbi. Mislim da to možemo ostaviti ne nužno samo kao terminološko pitanje, ali to ostavimo za kraj i ne na engleskome, jer care je poprilično monopolizira onda diskusiju o tome, pokušat ćemo možda govoriti na nekom od ovih drugih jezika. A ja bih samo napomenuo također, mislim, jedan dio vas je jučer bio također u Mami. Jedna od stvari koja mi se također čini važno koji put spomenuti je i kontekst. Znači, jučer smo u Mami imali promociju i razgovor o knjizi Pirate Care, znači Valerije Graciano, Marcela Marsa i Tomislava Medaka. Ponovo obiteljska na neki način stvar, mislim, koja ističe tu, mislim, za nas tu važnost toga koncepta skrbi ili brige. I spomenu također jednu knjigu koja onda ponovo vezana uz neki način uz naš kontekst, knjigu koju je bio za prevođenje bio, Tomislav je Medak bio preporučio, pa smo onda Mika iz Bukse i ja kao urednici i članovi urednikovog kolegija u AGM-u smo također prošle godine objavili manifest skrbi The Care kolektiva i Lin Segal je prošle godine bila u Zagrebu. Tako da mi se čini da, evo, to je također jedan kontekst i možda govori o važnosti toga koncepta o kojoj ćemo večeras razgovoriti. Prije nego onda sad krenemo sa pitanjima, ja ću vas zamoliti za mali pljesak ohrabrenja nama tu. Okay, so I switch now to our hegemonic language. Since some of you already know Bojana's work, but nevertheless I think what would be interesting to know, maybe as a starter, how will you describe your own way, I mean, your own trajectory from your investigations, books and publications you have done, and also your dramaturgical work? What was your trajectory up until now that in a way made the topic of care so important and that it emerged for you as a specific topic?
Yeah, I will jump back a little bit to the non-hegemonic language, samo da rečem hvala. Hvala svima, hvala Buksi, Mami i isto formatu C da smo danas tu i hvala i prevoditelju Marku Kopiću i uredniku Gregoru Modru, jer to je zaista nastalo onda u surađivanju. I samo da kažem da sam veoma vesela da sam danas sa vama, ali ne mogu da govorim na hrvatskom jer živim već 10 godina u Njemačkoj i nemam više tako kontakta sa hrvatskim jezikom. I isto tako ta knjiga je bila napisana, to je bio i moj izazov, da sam to knjigu napisala na slovenskom najprije jer sam u prošlih 10 godina se uvijek vraćala u Sloveniju, ali uvijek sam tamo govorila u međunarodnom kontekstu na engleskom. Tako da mi se desilo da sam 10 godina došla u Sloveniju, predavala, ali uvijek na engleskom. I onda sam rekla, ja moram napisati nešto na slovenskom jer to je moj jezik i moram da teoretski nešto premislim, ali zato ćemo danas govoriti na engleskom jer zaista nemam takvog kontakta sa hrvatskom jezikom. Ali pitanja mogu da budu na hrvatskom i možemo možda malo da vidimo ako ide. Yeah, so I will follow your question, Petar, and maybe I will connect this book also to the previous book you mentioned, Artist at Work, because it's not a kind of continuation, but it has a kind of same obsession. I'm always very obsessed with the, let's say, the ways how artists, cultural workers, but also cultural organizations, and the whole cultural sphere discursively frame their work and their labor. So that is something very interesting for me. Like, for example, Artists at Work came from observation of the processes in, especially in the visual art and performance art practice in the beginning of the 21st century, like let's say 20 years ago, where I was very actively also working with different artists and in the cultural sphere, also as a cultural activist in Ljubljana and so on, and was more and more observing how the discourse or a kind of framing and also a kind of a presentation of the and understanding of the very notion of artistic labor and work is very connected to some notions which are tightly entangled with the post-40s mode of working, like the collaboration, the production of the affective value. There was a lot of the production of subjectivity and so on, and that was actually something what I explored in this book, Artist at Work, which was published in Slovenia in 2012. And we know that quite something changed, or at least I observed that quite something changed in the, this kind of way of how discursively artistic processes are framed in the last decade. We got a kind of a huge shift also in the self-understanding of curatorial processes, where more and more the discourse went into the notion of care. So that came out in big exhibition, big institutional context, but also in a smaller frames. Then also in the artistic collaboration, there was a shift in this more, let's say, ethical dimension of the way how to understand the artistic work. So I started to be very curious, like what kind of shift is actually going on in the artistic field. And from this interest, actually also the book and my engagement with care comes. So this book is actually really also connected to the notion of the, or to the exploration of the precarious labor, but it kind of enters into it from another perspective, I think from a very complex and ambivalent set of values which were somehow established around the precarious labor in the last decades. And this is something where I then took this notion of care as a kind of a common and very ambivalent empty signifier which goes through all these values and either politicize them but also repoliticize them and so on. So this was something what I wanted to examine in the book.
Maybe you start the book, something which I think is interesting, and with the proclamation that, so I mean now the one book we are talking about, that you started in a way with a, now I will translate, Croatian translation of a Slovene. So you started out of certain uneasiness for in the last decade, then you have been confronted with the discourse of care in arts. And it comes from a certain uneasiness with the, how the concept is invoked. or then even more prominent, you say, I mean, uneasiness, many of them, or some of them, and also you say that you also had the physical kind of anxieties if confronted with this invocation of care. So I would say, I try to provoke you, if you say that this uneasiness, what you will say, maybe a couple of examples, be it artists, artworks, or a situation that you have been, that you would say have been paradigmatic for you, I mean, to provoke this uneasiness or ambivalence if evoking such new concept, or at least expanded concept as care.
Yeah, this uneasiness came actually from a kind of inflation of, how to say, you know, like I remember my colleague Miriam Van Imschot, a dramaturg and now a sound artist, who like 15 years ago or like even 20 years ago said, I feel uneasiness when I hear the word collaboration. And I was thinking, why do I feel now the uneasiness? Like, what kind of uneasiness is in the relation to this kind of reappearance of the common denominator or description of specific relationality as care? And I think it comes from a very concrete context. Some, of course, are related really to my observation of huge discursive shift in curatorial concepts, which there were a lot of exhibitions in the last 15 years which somehow refer to care, and they had care also in their curatorial concept, and this somehow covered a lot of different contexts, from relation of art and healing, the disclosure of a decolonial topic. Of course, it was related to whole Me Too movement and so on. All these kind of political and ethical shifts, which of course happened in the last 2 decades. But also, like in European context, you had a lot of discussion on care in the projects which were artistic projects which were dealing with the migrant crisis in the 2015-2017. One of the works I also discuss in the book very concretely and very detailed is the work of the German collective Institut für politische Schönheit, Institute for Political Beauty, where I discussed the works which were very, how to say, loud in the German public as a kind of provocative work of subversive affirmation relating to the position of German borders and European borders and migrant crisis, and actually really kind of standing in this kind of, let's say, avant-garde notion of art to fight for a better society. But at the same time, if you really go into analysis of these works, you see that they are actually using and working with the totally same protocols as protocols of big media, big companies, and so on. So there's something very problematic. And then, of course, what was very interesting for me also was a kind of a shift in a notion or in a discourse on collaboration in collective practices or practices of artists. So, for example, especially in the self-organized modes of work in art fields, more and more these values of care were brought at the forefront, and that was of course a political need somehow to tackle very different situations from which people were working in a specific cultural environment. But it also had a kind of problematic issue with precarious as a common value. So there was something what joins us through care, like which makes us in common, which that we share the same values. And this is actually something what I described as uneasiness, that there is a kind of presupposition that when we think or when we discursively frame or describe our labor as caring labor, that there is immediately related to some kind of a good value and so on. So this is something what I wanted to explore. So it really came from these 3 different fields, so curatorial context, self-organization of artistic practices and shifts from collaboration to care, and of course very concrete artistic projects which I am also discussing in the book. So that would be, and maybe uneasiness also, because I really strongly believe that ontologically and philosophically actually we are not, we cannot live if we are not touched by the work of care, and that there is something very interestingly ontologically when we think about care. So the book is also a little bit dealing with this uneasiness. On one side I somehow make a kind of a critical analysis of this discourse, but on the other side I also try to write through in the way that I actually affirm also the discourse on care, but maybe from another theoretical perspective, like more feminist perspective, or even some decolonial theoreticians who are then coming into the book and try really to maybe open up the complexity of this discourse when we are thinking about care. Yeah.
I would say particularly the function or the reference, your references to, I guess she's probably the most cited reference in the book, Solirovnik, or also Marina Garcés, so
yeah.
Quite many and other feminists and other female theorists. So it's you also once described not just as a value invoked, but also somehow, I would say sarcastically, also as care as the added value, something which is always in a very almost opportunistically invoked just to signal the well-meaning, well-being privileged position, but in as much also just comes as a secondary whatever invocation, and not as a practice that is in a way, I still think, or anybody who will take up this book will see it is a book which, though it also at quite many occasions tries to explode the conceptual and the practical framework of art and art fields, it nevertheless has still a very strict ontological premises and goes. So it's, would you say that for you, I mean, from a previous book on the proximity of capitalism and arts, that for you, I mean, quite many references you already had there, but has something in you changed? Not just those external occasions that something has become en vogue, like the concept of care, but also in the theoretical sense that that this book has been particularly important for you.
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's why also this book has this very maybe kind of enigmatic title, Life of Art, Život, umjetnosti. So what would that be? Because if in the first book I was actually dealing a lot with the life of artist. Here I really was interested in how we can think about that, and what changed for me is actually really that I try to there is a kind of a main hypothesis going all the time through the book, and this comes from the formulation of Sarah Ahmed, who think about care as a kind of a lifeline. This is a kind of a main metaphor. And there is this paradox of the lifeline, that if you throw a lifeline to somebody, you also destabilize yourself. You can also fall into the water yourself if you try to help. And I started to think how, when, let's say, this care is not really a kind of a discourse, but really a kind of ontological need, or that it also destabilizes the way how art is in the world, is being shared, is circulating, and so on. So for me there is a kind of a huge shift also in the way how do we think about production and economy of art. And I wanted to somehow destabilize this kind of a common values, which I somehow also felt came as a kind of discourse after I wrote The Artist at Work. So I was participating a lot on a kind of presentation of this book or talks where I had a kind of feeling that I also caused a little bit this problem with my own discourse in the book, that suddenly there was this kind of discourse on precarity, which was really like almost like abstracted from its material grounds as a kind of a common affective and emotional value. And it was a notion which was more and more becoming a cultural notion and not actually a notion of labor. And I was thinking like, what if we really don't think about precarity, but we think really about poverty, we think really about economic issues, about a relationship of power in the production of art, where we just cannot escape into a common sharing of the values, but actually we have to negotiate the differences through very difficult relationship of power, which are always there and always appearing. And I think this was something what I wanted to maybe this shifts from the artist at work. So I think that artist at work, of course, it was also written in different periods of work in the artistic field. Maybe even the book came out at the end of still a kind of optimism that things are possible, because of course I'm talking about like kind of international European context where I was moving and writing. And this book came actually from a kind of huge cracks or conflicts around the way how art is actually in the world, to whom it is belonging, how it is shared. So for me, this is really something what I wanted to address through that. And I think because of that kind of instability of that shared values, care also functions as this kind of empty signifier. It gives us a kind of a good value back, but it actually really comes from a very problematic field where we are, where really the notions also of the autonomy are tackled, of the artistic freedom and so on. Like there is a chapter in the book where I really go deeply into a Kulturkampf and how we can think through the notion of care, through it and so on. So these are maybe the things which are different in this book. Yeah.
I mean, what is interesting in the premises, in the theoretical framework, is that I would say this book is, I mean, it has a kind of a target, and the target, if you take Život, umjetnosti, life of art, I mean, this has been the topic, the manifest topic of the 20th century arts.
Yeah.
Almost all of them, bridging somehow life and arts, and vice versa, and yeah, from the avant-gardes, early avant-gardes until now, that was the question. But there you follow, and yeah, maybe this will be now the new thing. There you follow strictly insights by decolonial and feminism, especially decolonial theorists, who say, okay, I mean, the manifest project of bridging life and art and life, as heroic or as provocative or as inventive, it has been actually always, as its base, had something that you referenced mostly, Sully Rolnik, is among others, the base, the premise of such a heroic gesture had been capitalism, or capitalist modernity, and colonial capitalist modernity. There you say, okay, now with the care, or how I understand it, my project would be somehow to go not beyond it, but somehow to devalue or whatever we deflate this kind of gestures, and this still taking somehow a privilege of belonging to some kind of modernist, capitalist and colonial project.
Yeah, for example, I concretely write about one event in Ljubljana, which I found quite interesting in this relation to, because I'm quite, really trying to analyze the problematic defense of art in the way, so I'm discussing different examples where life of artists together with the life of art were really endangered, by example, because of the populist reaction, like in Brazil, and then in Slovenia with Janez Janša, I discussed Maja Srekar example and so on, which is now really, again, very much pertinent in the right-wing populist discourse. And then but on the other side, I also problematize the defense of, which is mostly coming sometimes from the left, or also from the mainstream discourse, the defense which is defending, yeah, but there is an artistic freedom of expression and so on, and we have to take care of it and so on. And I show that actually inside this kind of defense for the artistic freedom, there are very different positions who are very differently also situated economically, politically, and so on. And there is this almost parallel example in Ljubljana. When I was writing the book, this was actually happening. So you had this very nice, beautiful space in Ljubljana, which was renovated and given to the contemporary art Cukrarna. And almost parallelly later, the Rok Autonomous Center was really violently destroyed in the time of pandemic, like in the time of COVID. And what was very interesting is that when these fights for Rok were going on, and of course they lost and they could not continue, now Rok is also a kind of new, shiny and beautiful creative center. There was a kind of an artist, feminist artist from Austria. She put one sentence on the facade of Cukrarna, which was kind of claiming sentence for feminist emancipation and so on, and somehow it was burned out in the middle of the night. And it was interesting in this situation that the same mayor who 2 weeks before was emptying out the center of Rok defended this sentence as the sentence for artistic freedom. And I think that this is, for me, these are these paradoxes which are a little bit, if we think theoretically through them, they're a little bit similar also in the debates in feminist theory, like the debates around white feminism or middle-class feminism and so on. So all these kind of problems of somehow closing down very different situations from which this defense of freedom are also coming, and how are actually connected to the economic situation. And I think that this, of course, comes still from this very, let's say, capitalist, but also colonial project of a very particular understanding of art, which is also very criticized, for example, by Sueli Rolnik as a kind of main reference. No?
I would say what is interesting, I mean, as a provocation you have put, either referencing or by yourself in the book, is that once care is taken as a not just as a metaphor but as an operative concept, and that it's not just a new vocabulary, but it is shifting the spatial-temporal historical perspective. So it opens up, or in a way also destroys, deconstructs a line of progressist thought that actually care, would be not just the most emancipatory topic, but actually that care also retroactively, in a way, opens up and, in a way, destabilizes the history so far, be it history of arts or political issue. There, I mean, what is in the book, I would say, is interesting in the sense that that at quite many pages you say, okay, care, I would say, proactively is something of value, but it is not per se a leftist or progressist value. It could also be invoked by conservatives. It could also serve other functions, which are not maybe ours, or that we not necessarily, share. And there is an interesting discussion you have had, and you have been citing a project of a number of artists who worked for, I guess, project in Sofia, and then they have written a manifesto, and the specific topic or specifics, I guess, is the 7 theses that those artists collaborating, trying to somehow to set up a manifesto. They say that one thing which they do not want to be is being political. So not being political. So, and they actually discuss the ambivalence. So could you maybe elaborate this, not being political?
Yeah, this is more in relation to a kind of understanding that if they, because I think that the reaction of being political was that they always already were seen as producing particular values which are good for the society and so on. And I think that what was for me very interesting was that this relation between the art and politics, I was just thinking why this relation between the art of politics is in the this context of care suddenly shifting to this ethical dimension. No? So, by example, or maybe not even ethical is not the right one, but it's actually moral. So suddenly we are discussing in the relation between art and politics who is good and who is bad. No? So why I think it's very interesting is also related to that what you also mentioned before, that care can be of course used for conservative appropriation and so on. And I was just thinking, like, for example, in German context, there is this wonderful work of Caroline Enke, a philosopher who wrote a book on Hass, hatred, and she talks about this notion of besorgte Bürger. No? So these are, this is a notion of actually conservative, mostly conservative people who are also then voting for the right-wing parties because they are they care for the safety, for the society, and so on. And it really appeared as a kind of besorgte Bürger. And of course, it's very interesting then that suddenly you have this denomination in the most progressive, political, engaged art, which is not actually in a kind of curatorial context anymore justifying itself or discursively framing itself as we are doing the political art, but actually discursively framing itself around the notion of care. And that was for me very interesting, like what happened there? Why, by example, still in 2010, we had so many exhibitions and so many discourses which were really trying to rethink about the notion of art and politics, sometimes also through a very problematic notion of participation. But nevertheless, there were a lot of ways of rethinking, like what is a political art today? And then you have this kind of suddenly, this kind of discursive shift into a lot of affective and emotional value of doing a good work for the other. So that, and for me, there is something interesting that there is a shift in, maybe in the way how the value comes back to art in its economic sharing, that the value has to come back that art shows that it's engaged, that it's engaged with the state of the world, that it cares about the state of the world. But the question is if this is really a political position, because it is not actually, it is very rarely an antagonistic position. It is a position of a kind of, yeah, so like the feminist theoreticians would really see the same position, by example, in the position of white mainstream feminism. No? So in the way, in that sense, maybe this is an interesting aspect. No?
I'll ask you a question which goes to something that Françoise Vergès, whom we had also the chance to host her last year, 2 years, 2 times in Zagreb. In her book on the notion of the museum, which is, if I'm correct, the title is borrowed from Frantz Fanon. It's called the Program of Absolute Disorder. There, Vergès is very strict on saying that the project of decolonizing a Western museum is no-go. I mean, she's very strict and tries to say that decolonization, if we say, as almost a parallel master signifier to care, that decolonization can maybe just be appropriate as much, but that the in a way kind of a whitewashing or pinkwashing or whatever, say greenwashing or
whatever,
of Western institutions by claiming that they are at least alerted to something decolonial is a no-go. I mean, what would you say? I mean, in regards to it, because in the book there is also a dichotomy you take from Ronick, which I'm correct, goes also to Felix Guattari, is the dichotomy of the micro-political and the micro-political. So there, in a way, macro-political would be something like the 20th century programs of bridging life and art as a kind of a heroic gesture, subversive gesture, unlike the micro-political, which is whole another realm. What would you say? I mean, as a tough question, but care. Would you say that care maybe has the same fate like what Vergès has thinks about decoloniality, in the sense that care, in a way that if it think foremost outside of that this is a new program of empowering or bettering the Western institutions, modern institutions, that this is a no-go. What would you say?
I think that it is a problem, that I think that this is exactly, there is no coincidence that care comes into a discursive framing of a lot of artistic events with a kind of appropriation or engagement with the decolonial discourse in art institutions, for sure. And, but with care, of course, this is actually where I am, where my uneasiness also comes in the book, because on the other side, I cannot, how to say, I cannot just make a discursive analysis, because it is also an ontological necessity. And for me, what was very interesting in the micro-political field, to observe maybe the way how artists also tries to survive or try to work further. There were also these discourses of care developed, but they were very situated in their economic, micro-political positions, of the way how they can self-organize and maybe find another way how to work. And I think that this is not, it's not on me to have this kind of objective position of critical analyst who would then go through all the discourses and say, because there are practices, myriad of practices appearing in the micro-political spheres which are going exactly into this politicization or by example, understanding care as a mutual practice or as a politically solidary practice and so on. So I think we should be very careful when we go with a kind of a sharp knife through, because there are very different layers, also economic layers, situations where there are very different practices of care at work. And that was actually a little bit of intention of the book. I would totally agree. I think that there are maybe some of the ways how the decolonial discourse came into the institutions, but mostly on the representative level, which is very problematic. And we see how fast it can also disappear with the political shifts. So I think there is something, but on a micro-political level, and that's maybe something what is related to the previous book, Artist at Work, on maybe to my work, because I work so much with different artists, and I also teach young artists and see how they work further and so on. I still believe that there is a lot of ways of inventive ways, but in that sense they are much closer to activist practices. They are much more understanding also care as a particular form of labor. This is much more a politicized way of how to maybe reorganize, that also the labor of care would be reorganized differently and so on. So there are very different practices on the micro-political level, and I think these go actually parallelly. And for me here, I really see the, how to say, I would not say this word hope, but there is a kind of, I think it is happening at the same time. And sometimes it's a little bit a pity that this huge discursive kind of power of showing that I'm good and progressive and so on, it's almost killed other practices which are going in the background. So that's maybe the way how I would answer. Yeah.
I think now maybe the last question before we open up the floor for your questions and interventions. Coming back to a very specific micropolitics or realm of micropolitical engagement, you being a German civil servant, you being a professor at the quite a famous school for drama and performing arts in Gießen in Germany, what would you say for yourself, the kind of pedagogical work you are doing, or now, I mean, not just researching, but also writing and thinking about care? What has shifted for you? I mean, how your own pedagogical practices have changed during the years? I mean, would you say now that even within an institution, state institution, that you have found some pockets of pedagogical work that would be instructive to share?
I think that also this book was somehow written in a dialogue with a lot of students I taught. So I did 2 or 3 seminars which were dealing with a lot of discussions I address in the book. It's, how to say, I have a very nice situation that I am part of the institute, which has a very interesting history of self-organized work already from its starts. And it is not a coincidence that I work there. So this was really not just to work in the academic sphere, but I really wanted to work there because there is a specific politics of how to run or how to work in an institution of the, like, let's say, academic institute. And there is a specific knowledge of giving the autonomy or a kind of way that the students can develop and taking care about the way how they use spaces, how they collaborate, how they work by themselves. For that, they need a lot of work from the side of us who are there employed to actually somehow take care that this institutional practice is given further and that it's somehow protected from a kind of more and more bureaucratic and ordering surrounding of the university. So this is really something what we are negotiating on a daily basis. And my teaching in that sense, I think it's very connected to that I always try to be there, to actually give the space for, because also I teach an international program where the students are coming all around the world with very different contexts, and but at the same time it's not so different because they also come to us because they would like to study with us. So it's actually really this more global, international art environment. And of course, it's in the last years, of course, with the whole situation also, with a lot of anxiety coming out also of the German relationship to Israel and to the Gaza and so on. There was really a lot of problems also with the students, also how to work, how to stay there, how to express and so on. And we really have to be very strategic and tactical to develop actually the frames where they can really study together and actually really use this time where they can be together because to develop their own practices. And what is also a very big part of our teaching is that we try to really enable the context for the students so that then when they finish, they can somehow develop the practices of support, collaborative support, not just networking, but really a kind of ways how they can also continue to work together. Because of course in this individualized precarious situation, it will be very difficult for the ones who continue. We know that we are educating a lot of students maybe for a very uncertain future, and that's actually really a big part of what we are doing there, to be aware of that and to actually really enable structures how they can maybe continue, or how they can already in the frame of studies develop specific structures which support them at least in the first 5 or 6 years of the work, because of course they work internationally and it's not always so easy then to maintain this. Yeah.
Hvala. I sad otvaramo za vas. Evo, ja sam nadam će biti interesantnih pitanja, provokacija, intervencija. Evo, izvolite. Mislim, pa se javite, mislim da prostor je dovoljno mali da će vas čuti, ja mislim i bez mikrofona. Evo, izvolite. Evo. Tomislav.
Okay. Well, in a way, care is ontologically primary if we understand that we are interdependent. However, I think what's typically the intention with this primacy are institutions. Since 2008, we've gone through a cycle of crises. Environmental crisis has manifested in a way that it hasn't before, as a global crisis, a planetary crisis. And that's one side of thing. Another side of thing is that the sphere of labor has fragmented much more, and salary act has become more prominent. So on the one side, precarization, on the other side, people working in institutions, and less maybe of a large industrial workforce in the global north or in the global west. And I think that's the conjuncture where the root of such currency of the notion of care is actually in the institutions. That they are not able to provide something as primary as care, and maybe it's the younger generation that feels the brunt of it, the generation that has come into the institutions of education or art since 2008. My sense is that we cannot fully give an account of what the notion of care brings to the fore unless we consider that crisis of institutions and think of care through institutions, because that which is ontologically primary cannot also be without that which is ontologically secondary. And I think in human societies, it's institutional realm.
Yeah, but I think you are totally right, and this can also be related to the crisis of artistic institutions. I think that's why the care is such a discourse in the artistic institution, because they are actually really in deep crisis. Like in the sense, like what is their function, especially, like I think that the kind of rethinking about institution through decolonial theories just is a kind of a symptom of the crisis of care in general. I totally agree, and I think that for me, what I was also writing in the book is this relation between the, let's say, the crisis of care in the institutional level, the whole problem of the chain of care, and how that is actually mirrored in a very particular way in the way how this comes as a discourse in art. Because it is also related to the crisis of the art production in general. We are somehow forming it into a kind of a notion of precarity, but actually we have a huge problem of class, of poverty. So I think this is also something what is very present in arts. And so I would agree. I think this is this is a symptom also of the crisis of the institutional organization in the field of art. I think all this kind of need of artistic institutions to produce the values of being good is actually a symptom of the crisis about which you are talking about, I would say. That's how I would see it, I think. No? And this hope of that the institutions are there to be open to more collaborative modes of labor or participatory modes and so on, I think there is this kind of, we can really see this crisis of the institutions in the way how the discourse of the art institutions itself became more and more grounded into a kind of production of the moral values, or we are good, we care for the world. So I think this is already the symptom that something is going very wrong. So I would relate that to that.
I would say that there is a lot of the new spirit of capitalism, not through creativity but through care.
Through care, yeah. That's and of course it's connected to the chain of care. Who is doing the labor of care? To the devaluation of the labor of care and so on. So that's, I think, interconnected. Yeah, I would agree. No.
Yeah, we touched slightly with this question and answer, but just follow up on your debate last. When you refer to institutions, you implicit thinking about cultural and art and cultural institutions.
From this perspective,
all right.
Yeah.
So I'll use the word institution, but in another level. This is maybe a little bit like, in my opinion, so I'd like to ask you what you think about that statement that I'm thinking about. Maybe it's a little bit bold statement. So, in my opinion, from a European perspective, and when I said European, I'm thinking about tax-paying system in Europe, unlike in the rest of the world. So in Europe, we're paying quite big, high level of taxes for certain institutions, state-based, to have a function, unlike in other countries. So we, as a taxpayer in whatever European country, there is a chunk of my taxes going for the healthcare, mental care, social care, and so on. And there are institutions in some countries, some ministries or some other forms of institutions. So I'm talking about that kind of institutions. And in my opinion, these institutions does not function well, that we can see a lot of poverty, injustice, inequality, and so on. So now I'll come close to my question, closer and closer. I need to put the context. What I witnessed as a cultural practitioner over 30 years, that gradually change cultural policies, and they change it from state to state, and maybe we can say originally those are leftist policies, including the care and output, visible output, in whatever national or EU cultural policies, and whoever is filling these questionnaires for the fundraising, there are all these checkpoints. Are you dealing with handicapped people? Are you dealing with immigrants? Are you going to all these kind of questions? And when you come to EU projects, there are even more of those kind of questions. And that's the results of such a politics. So, my opinion is that, so now this bold statement, maybe I'm completely wrong. I'd like to hear your opinion about that. That as these national or EU institutions does not actually fulfill their purpose, they are failing in their, and they operate on huge budgets, and they ping pong these things with art and culture. We cannot do it, we'll do it so badly. So you art and culture kind of people, and you have, to work with visibility much better than national institutions. So the visibility is like the key word here. And here's a little bit chunk of money for Ministry of Cultures to Creative Europe and this kind of, and then you do our work. And that's why, that's my opinion, that's one, it's kind of my, what I'm thinking about. Maybe I'm wrong. So what is my question for you as I didn't read your book. Do you have opinion about that? Do you agree with me, disagree, or what's your opinion about this statement?
Yeah, there is a discourse on, there is quite a lot of also observations and critical texts which are dealing with these problematics, that actually the art labor or the artistic practice is fulfilling that what the state sometimes would need to do. That's really an interesting shift in the observation. But I think it's even more problematic because it's not that there was a kind of a huge opening of two artistic institutions also on the level of cultural politics to do the social, like that what you are saying, that what actually is in the crisis in the institutions which would need to do it. But the problem is that, and I can observe this now at this moment in Germany, which is a really interesting, at least from my perspective, very, very interesting example of how the things are complicated and really problematic, because in Germany, at least in the last 20 years, there was always this mantra that art is important for democracy, and it was doing this kind of social role of providing, from different contexts also to the education, to the fight against extremism, so all this kind of caring work for equality, also in the relation to health, to disability, and so on. And it was a huge, huge discourse in cultural politics, which somehow also get its own form in the financing of art and artists in the COVID period, because they get a lot of money for this kind of programs. And now, in the last years, there are different lines which are coming into this field of really destabilizing, like what is the role of art and culture. So in all the cultural documents, you have exactly this written, that art is important for democracy and so on. This is a kind of a main way of how to finance art. But on the other side, there is a huge cancellation of artistic projects which are not on the line of the official politics, but also there were huge cuts now done, by example, for the arts production in Berlin and also inside Germany, without any, how to say, mainstream reaction that art is important. So there is a kind of a paradox. You have a politically programmatic program and cultural political program that art is important, but at the same time, almost the same politicians can do the cuts, and there is a huge social irrelevance of art at the same time. And this was actually really shock also for the artists who were protesting and organizing, that actually who was protesting were the artists, but actually the environment for which they programmatically and also some believed that they work didn't care. So so they did not support, or they didn't even care. They were not busy with it. And I think it's really a paradox for the society which puts arts in a core of fighting against extremism and populism and right wing, and at the same time just cuts everything with the same program of how art is important and so on. So I would just answer on your question with that. So I think it shows us that, of course, there are these cultural political operations, which, of course, like some are saying that it's instrumentalizing art to produce these values or these kind of labors and works which are not actually provided by the state. But also it's creating a very particular idea of artists, and even a self-presentation of artists went into this direction. But when it came to this critical moment, there was actually almost nobody who would say, yes, artists are really important for the democracy, and we are now in the moment, so we have to protect them. So, of course, artists were saying that, but this discourse was not enough. So there is something, I think, very, very interesting and very problematic in that, and it actually really, it is really related to this, why are these discourses about care so problematic and so ambivalent? So maybe in that way I can answer. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the sobering book and discussion around the ways how some specific concepts that we were using also in our discourses empty out their basic relatedness to the reality and to the social developments. And in the same way as it happened with work and labor and precarity, as you described, and also with care, we remember that education at one point was the thing which was in the focus, and then simply swallowed and emptied out from the point of interest of the arts. What is next? I mean, that's I'm curious. Like, what do you see now after? I think that the situation is also new again. It could be a part of the progress that we could follow. But as you said, I mean, the discussion on precarity is the discussion from better times. You know? So maybe in Sweden and Norway it matters still, you know. But today the poverty is a much more concrete issue, you know, than the issues of precarity and status of work, labor, organization, and so on. I don't want to say that they do not matter, but they do not provide the clarity of the situation. So after COVID and all of these cuts and late fascism blow, what is next?
Do you have an answer? I don't know. I was just thinking maybe it's really, the first thing is to learn how to organize again. I think this is also very important. It's really something what maybe it's also somehow covered with this kind of discourses. That's why I said that precarity starts to function not as a, it's really like a more a notion of a kind of a common culture. And that's very problematic. And of course, precarity is politically interesting when it really demands another form of organization or impossibility of organization. And then what do we do? And I think that this is something what, it's very interesting when I also teach young people and students. It's very fast to go through the discourse, but actually really the material practices of how to work together and organize yourself differently. This is really something what is a kind of a blank territory. Like, or how do you give this knowledge further if you have it? What does it mean? How do you share it? I think these are the main, this is what I was also saying before, this is why it is so important also with the teaching. Because it's not also, so I think maybe that could be the next, but I would not wish that this would become the next jeton. It's just something, so that is maybe, but it's really, now I'm really speculating, but this is really something what is missing. And also I think a very, to really understand also the very situations as a very, not just that very different, but that we really have a lot of people who are living in poverty, and how to deal with that, how to organize around that. It's not, so I think this is something what, for me at least, it was the most interesting point which came out now also of the artists who organized in Berlin, because first they organized like this classical against the cuts and the value of the artist. But there is a group of artists who really started to think, no, we have to actually organize ourselves on a different basis. This is not the way how we will come together. And I think that would be maybe a way how to think, how I would think. Maybe this is an interesting way. What is next? I don't know.
So yeah, I have a semi-structured comment/question. It's kind of touching upon the organizing and self-organizing groups. I feel a lot of arts institutions and art in general is tied upon the identity of the artist, or like the recognizable identity of an idea, and while care is not, like this identity is not maybe inherent to the care concept. So I don't know, do you feel like in the future these could be integrated? Because I see there's a huge interpolation, and while working in activist or artivist or art activist groups, everybody is always worrying like who is the person behind this group, while not asking the question like how can we help or what can we do, and not have our names attached to it necessarily. So I see a disconnect there somehow, like that somehow it's very hardly possible to collectivize, and we're actually taught by our institutions that collectivizing only happens as a result of a crisis. So it might not like interleave very well with the idea of an artist being this classless mythical creature who works out of love of their for art. So yeah, I feel like this is a struggle somehow that we all feel, but I'm just worried if it could ever combine, like could care be integrated into arts like permanently, not as a trend or as a need like that has that's temporary, but like permanent care.
It's an interesting question.
Sorry.
No, it's just interesting because I think I would turn it differently. I think we should not mystify care in the sense that it could ever, because that's also somehow how it is in art discourses, that this is something what can succeed. Actually, it always fails. It always, how to say, I think that if we would do it from the perspective also that it is related to a very specific form also of not just relationality but also labor, then of course it's always a kind of, it's not a value. I think this is the problem. It's not the value. It is a particular form of relationality, of maybe a common engagement for a thing we believe and we want to do it, but it's not a kind of a value. So I would say it cannot be integrated as such. It is really a particular form of, the way, or to say it differently, like a lot of like feminist critiques, like feminist theoreticians which I was reading, they were very critical towards the way how care was theorized by their own colleagues, for example. No? So inside the field which works together, there was a lot of negotiations and a critical relationship to what care is. And this is because it is related to, it is never a kind of relations of equals. There is always somebody who needs and somebody who helps. So there are always these kind of power relations and so on. So it always has to be kind of negotiated in common. And in that sense, it can succeed. Now, of course, when you are saying what could be the problem, that art is always still related, of course, to a subjectivity of an artist or to a name or to a personality which is behind or not. There is this kind of old idea, or old, like the idea of artists which we still have always lurking behind. This could be also, I think this is also, how to say, no, I lost the track. I had such a clever thought now, but now I lost it. Just a moment. Yeah, this I wanted to say. It is not so much the problem of an artist, it is a problem of the values which we expect that the art will bring us, or how these values are shared. So, for example, even if we have a collective, there is always a value of a name, so that there is this particular system of art which is connected to the capitalist modernity, which is related to a very specific production of value, and that's why it is so difficult. So then we have this kind of a paradoxes that you are maybe working in a collective and working around the notion of care, but this can become totally abstracted and appropriated in these circulations of value. So that's why for me this question of the life of art is interesting, because it's not the circulation of value of art, but it is a material practice which changes also the status of work in the way how it continues. So it can be that, or it can be that, and it can be that. So it is really something which I think is also very connected to the activist practices and so on. So they are not probably organized around a kind of return of the value like the art is. No? So this is maybe, this is the way how I would think. I think this is really in the system that also, that we are experiencing the crisis is that now there is this kind of big expectation to return the value which are more and more related not just to the social values but to the moral values, to the ethical values, to the continuous positioning of the values and so on. But nevertheless behind there is this still fetishized notion of the authorship and so on. So this is a kind of a paradox which is sometimes almost unbearable to hold. And I have like a kind of a hypothesis in my book, or a kind of one of the theses or more provocations, that actually the life of art means that actually the very life of art has to be changed radically. Like what does it mean? Like, and this is maybe philosophically interesting in its temporality. What are the different forms of organizations which are maybe not forms of organization around the work or something like that. So that would be maybe, I don't know if I answered you, but I tried to think with, yeah.
Ok, hvala. Prije nego što napravimo pauzu i onda kasnije Igorova izvedba, 3 kratke stvari. Ja mislim da znam što je sljedeće. Sljedeće sa Bojanom će biti, naši prijatelji iz Maske su razvili jedan predivan format, neku vrstu pravoga filozofskog teatra, izvedbe. 2 puta smo imali tu Mladena Dolara sa virusom i sa glasinama, ali nešto slično je Bojana napravila zapravo na neki način sa svojom knjigom. Tako da ćemo sljedeći put, jer će vjerojatno pisanje tvoje sljedeće knjige trebati nešto više vremena nego to, sljedeći put se u Zagrebu vidimo sa tvojom izvedbom. To je jedna stvar. A druga stvar, imamo primjerke knjige tu, tako da možete tu nabaviti, dobiti. I treća stvar, prije nego što završimo, da, danas je također i Blanin rođendan, tako da hvala ti još jedan put i srčno.